But the NWO, if that's your greatest story that you're attributed to in wrestling, maybe your second one is Sting and the rise of Crow Sting and that whole year story. And I feel like if you were to ask anybody, lay out that story, they go, well, he beats Hogan in the end. That's the end. So we get to Starrcade 97, there's the convoluted finish. Can you talk about, from your perspective, what was going to happen compared to what did happen and why?
In case you couldn't hear in the back, the gentleman up here said, "It doesn't work for me, brother," which I heard a lot. And that phrase is a phrase that will ricochet around inside of my skull for a long, long time. But here, I'm hesitating because I have a lot of affection and respect for Steve Borden. Most of this is Steve Borden's story to tell and not my story to tell. So I'm going to lay it out to you in a way that hopefully you'll understand and appreciate why I'm dancing around a direct answer. Steve Borden, and notice I'm separating Sting the character from Steve Borden the person. Steve Borden the person, and the reason I'm comfortable saying this is because I've seen him on tape acknowledging some of this. So I'm not telling you anything that Steve hasn't already acknowledged publicly. But there was a period in time, 96, 97, where Steve Borden was going through some intense personal issues. Now, at the same time, Steve Borden was the Crow character. The Crow character didn't work in the ring. The Crow character didn't really talk that much. The Crow character just hung around up in the rafters with a vulture on his shoulder. He looked spooky as shit, scared everybody to death, pointed his bat, right? He did that for over a year before we heard him say a word. And during that time, Steve Borden was dealing with a lot of personal issues. So we fast forward, now we come to Starrcade. What was the original plan? The original plan was Sting was going to put an end to Hulk Hogan, WCW was going to get their company back, the NWO was going to be on their heels, as heels, so to speak. They were going to be backing up. WCW's on top, and now it's time for NWO to figure out a way to rise again. That was kind of like the ebb and flow of the story. But there were personal issues involved, and when we got to Washington, D.C., plan was, when I landed in Washington, when Hulk landed in Washington, when Sting landed in Washington, that night before or that morning, the plan was for Sting to beat Hulk Hogan. Clean. No fast counts, no just 1, 2, 3, middle of the ring. After all this time, and then Sting was going to be the superhero once again. The mantle that he formerly held as the Crow Sting character, or the flat top Sting, surfer Sting character. Now he was going to shed that Crow character and be the babyface he had previously been. But when we all got together that afternoon, there was doubt. There was concern about where Steve Borden's head was at. And then it kind of cascaded from there. And it was like, that doesn't work for me, brother. Because of that doubt. Could have been, look, truth is, it would have worked. Sting would have come through. It would have been just fine. But it was one of those issues. You know, chemistry matters, folks. Chemistry really matters, and when the chemistry isn't right and there's insecurity or a lack of confidence, things can go south pretty quick, as it did that night.
And I mean, from your perspective, when that all happens, is there part of you that's thinking, but surely we just finish this bit the way we're gonna, and then move on? Or is it a case of, oh, Hulk's got creative control and it's easier to keep him happy?
You know, I was like, I'm the referee. I was trying to guide the conversation. I was trying to find solutions. I was trying to, you know, I knew Hulk pretty well by that point. I was able, most of the time, to do a pretty good job of managing where his head was at. But he was dug in pretty stiff. And now it's just a matter of, as they say in the wrestling business, how do we make chicken salad out of chicken? How do we make this, how do we get through this and make it as palatable as it can be? But it was a compromise. You know, we had a really great story. It was black, it was white, it was a good guy, it was a bad guy, it was a resolution. It was an arc that took over a year, almost a year and a half to play itself out. It was set up perfectly until about 3 o'clock that afternoon, and it all went to
So did Hulk originally say, I'm not losing to him, and you got him to the compromise of what we saw? Or was he willing to do what we saw?
It was more of a, you know, the issue revealed itself probably around 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The show was at 8. So we had about 5-6 hours to figure out what we wanted to do. Once it became clear that we weren't going to go with plan A, Kevin Sullivan got involved, different people got involved. It ended up being more of a collaboration amongst 4, 5, 6 people until everybody finally ended up with the cluster that we saw.
Was it important to you, though, for it to not be Hogan wins at the end of that night? For the story?
For the story, Sting should have won, clean. That was what was important to me, but that wasn't going to happen. It had to be a muddy finish.
I mean, you know, talking about the muddy finish, then we have Bret Hart kind of being involved, but the execution of it kind of makes Bret look like he's got involved in something that's kind of already sorted. I mean, how did something go wrong? Like, why did that end up looking like it did?
Because nobody was communicating. You got 4 or 5 people involved, and not everybody agreed 100% with the finish the way they wanted to do it. And if you go back and look at the tape very closely, there was supposed to be a fast count. Sting never got his shoulders up. It fell apart so badly and so fast because of lack of communication. And I said, oh God, where did I say this? I said this recently. I was watching something, and it's like, oh, I was on an episode of 83 Weeks, and Conrad and I were watching a Nitro back, and the finish was so convoluted and complicated that the fans can't. It's too nuanced, and there was just too many involved. You know, there's a saying, you know, a camel is a horse created by committee. And that's what that finish was. It was a camel. It ended up being a camel that started out as a horse that was created by a committee of people that weren't really doing a good job communicating. And honestly, Steve Borden bears some responsibility because he missed a kick out when he should have rolled the shoulder when he was supposed to, and he didn't. And that's one of the things that made Bret look so bad.
And how do you know, as the guy in charge, and you've got to deal with Hulk, who ultimately has creative control over what he does, other characters like Hall and Nash, who I'm assuming had their say in stuff that happened in WCW or their influence. How do you deal with that while still maintaining the idea that, you know, I'm in charge, this is the direction, without it kind of falling off the rails?
It's hard. It's always hard. For me, I just tended to be pretty honest. If you talk to Kevin Nash, he'll tell you that he and I had some brutal, you know, you more. Well, I'll you up is what I mean, we've had some brutal back and forths. And then we'd get done arguing like 2 old and then we'd just go have a beer and settle it and laugh about it and tell jokes. But everybody was different. You know, I never really had an issue with Scott Hall. Not in that regard. Scott just, whoa, whatever, dude. You tell me what to do, I'll do it. Point me in the right direction, bro. We're good. Kevin was tough. Kevin would bow up and exert his influence. You know, you just get through it. And for a while, I felt like, man, this is a weakness in my game. I'm not really good at this. And then working in WWE and working with some of the people at WWE and finding out that same thing happened to Vince McMahon. Same thing happens to directors on movies, directors on television series. You've got talent that wants one thing, you've got a director or a studio that wants another, and there's going to be a pissing contest. So you just have to get through it.
You've told the story a million times about getting Scott Hall, getting Kevin Nash. Talk to us kind of in detail about convincing Hulk to be the third guy, because maybe in some ways he knew that that was maybe the way out of this predicament that he was in.
That's really, it's fascinating. I didn't convince Hulk of anything. Hulk convinced me that he wanted to be the third guy. And let me tell you this story because it's really fascinating. Hulk, like I told you earlier, Hulk only owed us 4 pay-per-views a year. We'd done 2, I don't remember, probably Super Brawl and another one, whatever it was. So we didn't have any more pay-per-views on our schedule for Hulk Hogan until probably Fall Brawl and Starrcade. So there was going to be a period throughout the summer where we weren't going to use Hulk. And part of the reason for that is summertime for us in WCW at that time was the worst time of year to do a pay-per-view. People are on summer vacation, they're traveling, they're busy doing things. It's not a great time of the year for high-power pay-per-views. So we structured his 4 pay-per-views to do 2 of them in the winter and the spring, and then 2 of them in the fall and winter. So summer basically had Hulk was off. So Hulk was off, let me back up. So Scott Hall shows up May 27th, 1996. I know it was May 27th because it was my birthday. And I had to pick him up at the airport and drive him down to Macon, Georgia. And we had a nice chat on the way down to Macon because I had heard about Scott's reputation and I was a little concerned. But anyway, we get down to Macon, Georgia. Scott Hall comes down, he does his thing. Hulk Hogan is off doing a movie called Santa with Muscles. Raise your hand if you've ever seen Santa with Muscles. Are you shitting me? How the f*** did you find that? So he's off doing this movie called Santa with Muscles, right? Scott Hall comes in May, comes down through the crowd, does his thing. The following week, I think it was, Kevin Nash comes down and says, we got a third guy. Well, by that time, I had the idea. It was a rough idea, too. I don't want anybody to think that I had it all laid out. I just had basically a sketch on a piece of paper of the idea for the NWO. It wasn't even on paper. It was in my head, to be honest. I knew I wanted that invasion angle and that feeling. And I wanted a story with mystery. I wanted who's the third man going to be? I really wanted that mystery because I knew if I could get people talking about it, I could create a buzz. And if I could create a buzz, I could create interest. And if I could create interest, I could create cash, much like controversy. So we did the whole who's the third man thing. Now that story played out over the course of about 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. Who's the third man? Who's the third man? I had convinced Sting, Steve Borden, to turn heel and be the third man. Because a year before, I know I'm taking you guys all over this timeline, and I apologize if I confuse you, but a year before the NWO, and a year before Scott Hall came down, and a year before Kevin Nash, teased who's the third man, I had flown to Hulk Hogan's house, and because as we were talking about, we all knew the Hulk Hogan red and yellow, it wasn't working. He knew it, I knew it, everybody knew it. Somebody had to say something. That was my job. So I flew myself down to Hulk's, went to his house. I remember it was during the week. It was like a Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday afternoon. Got to his house about 1:30. Sat down. He had a case of beer waiting for me. We both liked to drink beer at the time. Excuse me. So I got to Hulk's house, and he takes me into his office. He's a big, beautiful, 15,000 square foot home. Sit down in his office, and we start talking, and I pitched it. I said, Hulk, I got this idea. It really wasn't an idea. It was a half-assed idea. But I said, what if we turn you heel, Hulk sits back in his chair. He got that big-ass Fu Manchu. And when you see him do this, when he curls those lips up like he just ate something that tastes like and he strokes that Fu Manchu, you don't want to be around for what's next. He's stroking him. He's nodding his head. He leans forward, looks at his watch, said, "Brother, you'll never understand until you walk a mile in my red and yellow boots. And I got to go pick my kids up from school, so thanks for coming down. Let's go." And literally, as elegantly as I've ever been thrown out of anything or anywhere, elegantly invited me to leave, told me I could take the beer with me, by the way, which I did, just so you know. And I was gone. That was it. He did not want to have a conversation, not a syllable of a conversation about turning heel. That was 1 year earlier, 1 year prior to Scott Hall coming down. Okay, backtrack again. Scott Hall comes out. Kevin Nash shows up. Hulk Hogan's up doing a horrible freaking movie called Santa with Muscles. Had a budget of about $85,000, whatever it was. It's horrible. But anyway, it's a movie that's being filmed in California, and it's way up in the mountains. So it looked like the North Pole or some like giant pine trees and stuff. It's supposed to look like a forest. So Hulk calls me up. This is after Kevin Nash showed up now. We've teased the third guy. I've convinced Sting, which was not easy, by the way. It took me maybe a month or so of convincing, selling. But Sting's in. He's ready to go. I've got my idea. Everything's in place. I got a game plan. I get a phone call from Hulk. "Hey, brother, any chance you could come out to California so we can talk about where I'm going to go for the rest of the year?" I said, "Sure, not a problem." So I jumped on a plane, flew out to California, got in a town car, headed up the mountain. Took about 8 hours to get there. It's midnight by the time I get to his movie set. I get to his, because he was locked out. He couldn't leave. And it was very, very isolated. So I get to his trailer, and I'm beat. I flew from Atlanta to LA and drove for 3 or 4 hours, whatever it was, to get to the movie set. I get to his trailer, and he's sitting back in his trailer, and he's got a case of beer on ice, and he's got a box of Cuban cigars, and he's smoking one of them. I walk in, "Hey, brother, good to see you." We hug, whatever. "Here's a beer." Sit down. We shoot the for a few minutes. Then he leans forward, starts stroking that Fu Manchu. I'm thinking, now what? "So, who's the third man?" It's not what I expected. I didn't want to tell him. No, it's not that I didn't trust him. Well, let me be clear. I didn't think he would maliciously or intentionally spill the beans, divulge anything, but Hulk he's like any of us. He gets excited about something, he can't wait to talk about it. And sometimes his judgment, like he'll talk about something because he'll think he's in a room full of people he can trust, and chances are you can't. Somebody's going to say something either because they're stupid and they don't know any better, or because they're just excited and they can't wait to share it. That's human nature. I've done that myself a lot of times, by the way. I'm guilty of what I'm suggesting I was afraid Hulk might do, which is why I didn't want to tell him. But I can't say, "Sorry, Hulk, I'm not telling you. It's a secret." Not telling you. I couldn't do that. So I'm thinking on my feet, actually on my ass drinking a beer, but I said, "Who do you think it should be?" Excusez-moi. So I did what most politicians do when they're confronted with a question they don't want to answer. They answer it with a question. And I said, who do you think it should be, Hulk? And he leaned forward again. He said, you're looking at him. That'll work. You know? And it was really, I'm having fun with it a little bit, but I'm about 70% right on the money with the way I just described that scene to you. Might have been a little different, might have taken a little bit longer, but that was essentially the conversation. Jimmy Hart had been sending Hulk VHS tapes, if you can believe it. That's what we had back then. But every Monday night, Jimmy would FedEx these tapes to Hulk, and he would get them, and he'd watch them so he could keep track of what was going on in the shows. And when he saw Scott Hall come down, that got his attention. Then he saw Kevin Nash come down. Then it's, confronting me, and we got a third guy. It's like, he convinced me. I didn't have to convince him. Keep in mind that I had spent a month convincing Steve Morden, a.k.a. Sting, to make this dramatic move and how great it was going to be for his career and how much confidence I had in it. And we were pretty good friends at that point in time anyway. And we stayed close. Steve Morden is a great guy. But I had worked really hard to convince Sting to turn heel and be that third man. And now I got Hulk saying, I think I'm going to do that. And I'm all excited about it until I sobered up the next morning and got on a plane and went, I gotta call Sting and say, sorry, deal's off. But he handled it well.
I mean, this is an impossible question to ask, but I'm just going to ask it. If Hogan hadn't said yes and Sting was the third guy, do you think it would have had half the impact that it did?
No. Honest, it would have been great. The quality of the story would have been just as good, but the impact wouldn't have been half. Hulk Hogan had been known worldwide for a decade and a half at that point. He was the largest name in professional wrestling history at that point, but he had always been a good guy. There was nobody out there of that magnitude as far as awareness and recognizability and just relationship with the wrestling audience that had been a babyface 100% of the time, for the most part. Take out 6 months or so into his early career, but for the most part, as far as the world knew, he was just this ultimate babyface. And it was that, because what Hulk did is he betrayed. Betrayal is like one of the most powerful elements in any story. Right? I'm reading a book, and I've been reading it now for about 2 years, but it's the 7 basic plots. There are really only 7 basic stories that have ever been told since the time that people sat in caves and drew pictures of the hunt with the sticks that they had in the fire on the walls of a cave. The stories are essentially the same. And betrayal is one of the key elements of so many of those stories. And what Hulk Hogan did when he turned heel is he betrayed the wrestling audience that loved him for as long as they did and believed in him. Sting couldn't have done that. He could have executed it better. He could have carried it in many ways better because he was more physically able and gifted at that point. But it would have never had the impact of Hulk Hogan turning heel. There were people, when he dropped that leg on Randy, I remember I was sitting up in the cheap seats. I wanted to see it from the fans' perspective. I didn't want to see it on the monitor in the back or sitting in a production truck, because you're separated, you're distanced from the real emotion when you're in a truck or you're looking on a little monitor. It's not real. I wanted to go out in the audience and feel it. So I went way up in the stands where nobody would recognize me and had a hat pulled down over my head, and I'm up there. And when Hulk Hogan dropped that leg, I watched that, but I immediately shifted my focus to the audience because I wanted to see how the audience was going to react. And they went from, if you go back and watch the tape, Hogan drops the leg. He comes out, everybody's, hey, Hulk Hogan, he's here to save the day, because that was the formula. That's what people were used to seeing. And then when he dropped that leg on Randy, for the first 20 seconds, nobody reacted. And then when they did, it was like oh my God. And then it turned into hate. They got pissed. And that's when I went, oh, this is so good. This is so good. I don't know if you all have Blue Chew here, but I had the wrestling version of Blue Chew going on. I was like, bang! This is awesome.